Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Assignment China, an oral history of American journalists in the People's Republic, by Mike Chinoy, narrated by Eric Jason Martin. Introduction. In the summer of 1973, I made my first visit to China, joining a group of left-wing American students. At the Wusun People's Commune outside Xinjiang, we met model Maoist peasant Yu Kexin. Yu had a broad, weather-beaten face and thick, calloused hands, and was wearing a Mao cap. He sat quietly as officials regaled us with statistics to show the commune's achievements, but in his small brick home, he and his wife, Li Lianfeng, turned out to be the warmest of hosts. They brought out dish after dish, stir-fried eggs with scallions, chicken, vegetables, noodles with black bean sauce, corn on the cob, and an endless supply of rice and melons. The food was the best I had in China. As I wrote in my journal afterward, the attitude of the family was so friendly and positive that it became the highlight of my trip. 20 years later, I discovered it was all a lie. In 1993, as CNN's Beijing bureau chief, I retraced that 1973 journey. My goal was to learn what had happened to the places I had visited and the people I had met for a series of TV reports on the social and economic transformation underway in China. By then, because I had been based in Beijing for 6 years and had covered the Chinese army crackdown on protesting students in Tiananmen Square in 1989, my illusions about the great Chinese political experiment, which had sparked my initial interest in the country, had long been shattered. But even under these circumstances, my reunion with Yu Kexin was an eye-opening moment. With the help of the local Foreign Affairs Office, or Weiban, through which all foreign correspondents then had to route requests for travel and coverage, I was able to track Yu down and get permission to return to his village and speak with him. No longer living in the simple brick dwelling where we first met, he now had a nicely furnished flat with a TV. A beneficiary of the market-oriented reforms introduced by Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, he had given up working in the fields and was now running a tractor repair shop. His life had clearly improved. As soon as the local officials were out of earshot, however, Yu confessed that almost everything I had experienced during my first visit 20 years before had been an illusion. "I told you then that things were good," he said, "but when you foreigners came, conditions were terrible. Our income was tiny. They didn't let us raise animals or grow anything for ourselves. We got that meal only because you came. It was trucked in from the city the day before. Back then, we were lucky to have a good meal once a week, or even once a month." Even after 2 decades of experience following China, I was sobered by what Yu said. When I look back, the episode underscores the central theme that emerges in any discussion about the history and experiences of the foreign correspondents who have covered China. The challenge of finding the truth in a vast, complicated country with a long history of distrust of outsiders, a secretive and authoritarian political system deeply suspicious of journalists, and no qualms about deliberately lying or twisting reality to suit the political needs of the Chinese Communist Party. The stakes could not be higher. As Sino-American relations have swung from World War II ally to Cold War enemy to common foe of the Soviet Union to cuddly communists embracing the market to emerging economic superpower and strategic rival, how to deal with the country has consistently been a crucial and contentious issue in the United States. Reporters for the American media have played a critical role, profoundly influencing U.S. views of the country as well as the policies of successive American governments. Moreover, because of the reach of U.S. news organizations such as the New York Times, the major TV networks, and the wire services, such coverage has also shaped perceptions of China around the world. For many consumers of news, however, the way the information they read in newspapers, in magazines, or online, listen to on the radio, or watch on television actually reaches them remains a mystery. In my more than 30 years as a foreign correspondent, it became clear that an enormous gap existed between the actual dynamic of reporting, writing, and transmitting the news and the final product seen by readers and viewers. Yet the nature of that process, and of the people engaged in it, remains the crucial foundation of any news report, and how the sophisticated news consumer can make sense of it. This is true of coverage all over the world, but is especially relevant for China, where journalists have struggled to report on a complex society with an opaque political system while being buffeted by pressure from the authorities in both Beijing and Washington, not to mention pressure from editors and the remorseless demands of their profession. Understanding the people who have reported on China and how they have done so is, therefore, a crucial step in understanding the news people watch and read. Providing that understanding is the central goal of this book. Over the years, many of those who have covered the country have written their own memoirs or assisted other scholars and authors of books about China. Nevertheless, there has been no systematic effort to assemble a collective history of these colorful journalists with the focus on how they understood and reported the remarkable events they witnessed. Assignment China is intended to offer a fresh perspective, a self-portrait of several generations of American China correspondents from 1945 to the present day. Their stories, never before collected into a comprehensive history, can serve a primer on nearly 80 years of dramatic political, social, and economic change as seen through the eyes of journalists who covered those developments. This book is the outgrowth of a 12-part documentary film series produced by the U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California. The series, which I started working on in 2008, was based on more than 100 videotaped interviews with journalists who covered China, diplomats and others who interacted with them, and scholars who have studied both China and the media. As in most film projects, the limitations of time and format meant that many fascinating comments and stories were left on the cutting room floor. Yet the experience of these China hands provides significant insights about China, Sino-American relations, and the craft of journalism. Hence this book, which incorporates not only material included in the 12 episodes, but much more that was left out, as well as nearly 24 additional interviews. All of them have been lightly edited and condensed for clarity. When we began the project in 2008, we decided that it would be based on interviews we ourselves would conduct. In a few cases, we also included especially valuable excerpts of other interviews or memoirs, which are cited in the footnotes. For example, John Roderick, the great Associated Press China correspondent, who covered the Civil War in the 1940s, was a China watcher in the 1950s and 1960s, returned to China to report on the visit of the U.S. ping-pong team in 1971, and then reopened the AP Beijing Bureau in 1978, died in 2008. However, upon his retirement from the AP, the organization did a long interview with him, and the AP archives kindly gave us permission to use it. Sadly, a number of those we were able to interview have passed away in more recent years. Not all of them wrote books or memoirs. In many cases, their interviews for Assignment China constitute the only record of what they did, how they did it, and what they felt or thought about it. We also made a conscious decision not to look in detail at American coverage of Taiwan and Hong Kong. Unquestionably, both are hugely important. Taiwan has been one of the most sensitive issues in Sino-American relations and remains an economic powerhouse, a remarkable example of how an authoritarian system can transition to a vibrant democracy and a flashpoint that could conceivably lead to an armed conflict. Hong Kong, from its role after the Communist Revolution as the listening post for covering China, to the handover in 1997 and Beijing's more recent imposition of a draconian national security law, has also been of central importance. Developments in both places have frequently been covered by the same correspondents who were reporting on mainland China, and both locations do feature in this book. But Taiwan and Hong Kong have such distinct, rich, and complex histories that it was simply not possible to do full justice here to the story of the journalists who reported about these two remarkable societies over so many decades. Equally, there was no way to include all members of the multiple generations of reporters who have covered China over the past 8 decades. But the people whose accounts do feature here represent a rich and representative cross-section of the American media, newspapers, magazines, the wire services, radio, television, and online, as well as diplomats and scholars who interacted with or studied them. One significant omission concerns the local Chinese drivers, fixers, and interpreters who worked in American news bureaus. Correspondents were virtually unanimous in emphasizing how important such people were to their coverage. But as Chinese nationals, local staff have always been in a sensitive and often risky position, frequently pressured to act as informants by the Chinese authorities, often intimidated, and sometimes forced to quit their jobs. Under these circumstances, a deliberate decision was made, for their own safety, not to reach out to those who worked as local staff to speak on the record for this project. In this project, we seek to answer questions at the heart of the way foreign correspondents operate. Who were the people who covered China for the American media? How did they collect, understand, and transmit the news? What sort of mental baggage did they bring? What kind of dealings did they have with a Chinese government that was usually hostile, suspicious, and uncooperative? How did they cope with language and cultural differences and manage relationships with ordinary Chinese citizens with whom they came into contact? What kind of interactions did they have with their editors and bosses? To what extent were they influenced by the policy priorities of the U.S. government? How did the dramatic changes in media technology, from print and radio to television, satellites, the 24-hour news cycle, the Internet, and social media, shape the way they covered China? How accurate was the picture of China they presented? What were some of the consequences of how the country was reported? Over the course of the interviews, one common thread became clear. For many of the journalists who have covered China for the U.S. media, myself included, the country was not so much an assignment as an abiding passion. The China beat shaped and defined our careers. We studied the language, culture, and history, and found in journalism what we believed was the best way to get access to and dig beneath the surface of a vast, fascinating, often poorly understood but enormously consequential nation. Like the documentary series, this story begins in 1945, the year that World War II ended and the final phase of the Chinese Civil War began. When China was at war, the obstacles to coverage were primarily logistical, how to get around in a backward, chaotic country with severed road and rail lines, primitive communications, and territory divided between areas controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and those controlled by Mao Zedong's communists. After the communist triumph in 1949, reporting on China faced a different challenge. American journalists, like those from most Western countries, were no longer allowed to operate in the newly established People's Republic. For more than 2 decades, apart from very occasional visitors, most coverage was done by China watchers from places like Hong Kong. Reporters were forced to make sense of China without being able to go there and see for themselves. With the visit of President Richard Nixon in 1972, the door began, slowly, to open. But it was not until the normalization of Sino-American relations in 1979 that Beijing agreed to allow correspondents for U.S. news organizations to be stationed again in the Chinese capital. Since then, American journalists based in China have witnessed the country's astonishing transformation from a poor, isolated nation devastated by Mao's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution to an emerging economic and diplomatic powerhouse now challenging the United States for global supremacy. There have been many ups and downs, both in China's journey and in reporters' experiences covering it. But during all these years, one theme stands out: the near-constant struggle of American journalists to test the boundaries, challenge the restrictions on coverage at the heart of the communist system, and explore parts of Chinese society that had long been off-limits. All the while, the Communist Party sought to discourage or prevent them from doing so. This tension, which I encountered during my visits with model peasant Yu Kexin, dates back to the founding of the People's Republic. Even reporters like Edgar Snow, whose book Red Star Over China made him Beijing's preferred Western journalist, struggled with restrictions when visiting the country in the 1960s. For others, less trusted by the regime, the constraints have been even tighter. How successful the party has been in this effort has largely reflected China's domestic political climate. In the 1980s, arguably the most liberal period in the history of the People's Republic, the ability to travel and talk freely with ordinary Chinese increased significantly. The repression following the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989 imposed new obstacles on foreign reporters, but as the Chinese economy began to liberalize and grow in the 1990s and early 2000s, so too did the ability of resident correspondents to dig deeper into Chinese society. There was still much official resistance, but especially with the approach of the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing, whose official slogan, crafted by the Communist Party, was "A more open Beijing awaits the Olympics," the authorities dramatically relaxed the rules governing foreign reporters. In the wake of the Olympics, however, and after Xi Jinping became the country's leader in 2012, the pendulum swung sharply in the other direction. In a society that had itself become much more open to increased engagement with the rest of the world, with the rise of a Chinese middle class, the emergence of the Internet, and a more modern economy, it was no longer possible for the authorities in Beijing simply to keep foreign journalists confined to the capital. But as Xi Jinping has tightened central control and reversed even the mild political and intellectual relaxation of previous years, the Communist Party's effort to control the narrative of China around the world by targeting foreign correspondents has intensified. China-based reporters venturing into the field have faced increasing harassment and intimidation, often of a physical nature, as well as threats to cancel their visas and expel them. The steadily shrinking number of Chinese people willing to speak with foreign reporters often face severe consequences, including imprisonment. As China's relations with the U.S. deteriorated, the targeting of the American press intensified, climaxing in 2020 when Beijing expelled nearly 20 reporters working for leading U.S. media outlets like The New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. Yet even as access within the country has been curtailed, and journalists have increasingly been used as pawns in China's diplomatic battles with the United States, Beijing's growing international role has meant that, in an ironic twist on the 1950s and 1960s, when China watchers covered the country from outside its borders, some journalists today have developed new ways to report on China without setting foot in the People's Republic, focusing on everything from China's global economic ties, investment deals, and growing international footprint to the shady foreign dealings of its corrupt new elite. Still, in such a huge, important, and in many ways still undercovered country, Beijing's moves to reduce the size of the U.S. press corps are deeply troubling. This development is particularly worrisome at a time when the label fake news is being used by politicians and others in the West to discredit journalism with which they disagree. The Chinese government has also adopted the term to target foreign media coverage that challenges the narrative Beijing wants to impose, not only at home, but increasingly abroad. A central theme that emerged in virtually all the interviews done for this project was the curiosity, passion, courage, and cunning journalists must display to get their story. From Morley Safer of CBS pretending to be a travel agent to get a tourist visit to China at the height of the Cultural Revolution in 1967, to Jeff Widener of the AP finding a foreign student to hide the film in his underwear so the historic shot of the man in front of the tank could be smuggled past Chinese security following the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, to David Barboza of the New York Times spending months poring through dense corporate records to document the corruption of a top Chinese leader. The reporters whose stories are told here managed to overcome countless obstacles to present their best understanding of China to their readers, viewers, and listeners. With the benefit of hindsight, what is surprising is not how much they missed or got wrong, but, given the conditions under which they have been forced to work, how much they got right. There's an old saying that journalists write the first rough draft of history. As the United States and the rest of the world struggle to deal with a more authoritarian and assertive China, the story of those who had front-row seats for every twist and turn in its modern history, told in their own words, can add much to our understanding of one of the world's most complicated and important countries. 1. The Chinese Civil War. With the surrender of Japan in August 1945, World War II came to an end. But the struggle between Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, or KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, which dated back to the 1920s, was about to resume. Their conflict had been placed on hold since the late 1930s, as both parties entered an uneasy alliance to combat the Japanese. But while most of the world recognized Chiang as China's legitimate ruler, poverty, corruption, and the upheavals of war left his government severely weakened. Mao, meanwhile, had used the war to build a powerful force that, from his base in the remote northwest, controlled nearly 90 million people, a quarter of the population. China now had two rival governments. With American support, the KMT took control of China's major cities, while the Communists gained support in much of the countryside, assisted by Soviet forces that had occupied Manchuria, northeast China, in the waning days of the war. The United States attempted to broker a political settlement, promoting direct talks between Mao and Chiang in the autumn of 1945, and then sending America's most distinguished general, George Marshall, to mediate. But as Marshall discovered, neither the Communists nor Nationalists were serious about a compromise. There was too much distrust, and too many irreconcilable goals. As civil war loomed, 24-year-old New York native Seymour Topping, who had served as an infantry officer in the Pacific, met the Asian editor of the international news service Wire Agency in the Philippines. Seymour Topping, International News Service. I ran into Frank Robertson, who was in charge of INS in Asia. He offered me a job as a stringer, a part-time correspondent, in Peking. I got on an airplane. My title at that point was Chief Correspondent for North China and Manchuria, and my salary was $50 a month. Maine native John Roderick had worked for the Associated Press in Washington before the war. Drafted in 1943, he was sent to southwest China. As soon as he left the military, he rejoined the AP in Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek's wartime capital. There, he got to know Zhou Enlai, who had served as the Communist Party's liaison with American officials and journalists during the war. John Roderick, Associated Press. Zhou was a star, the darling of the press. He had a great charisma. When you were with him, he always concentrated on you, made you feel important. He made the Communists popular at a time when they might not have been. Henry Lieberman, who had studied Chinese at Columbia, joined the Foreign News Bureau of the Office of War Information in Washington in 1942, and later went to China as chief news editor of the agency's China branch. At the end of the war, he was appointed the New York Times China correspondent. He was equally impressed with Zhou, but at a conference of China hands nearly 40 years later, concluded Joe's charm was just a show to win over Western reporters. Henry Lieberman, New York Times. Zhou Enlai was one of the greatest people I ever encountered, in terms of his charisma, his mental ability, his skills. And he was one of the world's greatest actors. I spent hour after hour with him trying to get his story. He had a trick that he'd pull. Joe spoke poor English, so far as I could make out. The interpreter would go on translating, and then at some strategic point in the interview, Joe would stop the interpreter and say to him in English, "No, not that word, this word." Yan'an. Although no significant agreements were reached during Marshall's year-long mission, while it continued, the Communists allowed American reporters to visit their headquarters in Yan'an in the remote Northwest, the endpoint of the famous Long March in the 1930s. Zhou Enlai arranged for John Roderick to go. Between 1945 and 1947, Roderick spent 7 months there. John Roderick, Associated Press. We arrived after a trip which looked like a voyage over the moon. We were met at the airport by Huang Hua. He spoke perfect English and later became foreign minister. He took us into town. Yan'an was extraordinary. It was a city of 10,000 caves. The Japanese had bombarded the old walled city and driven the Communists to dig into this soft, less soil. They created cave hospitals, cave universities, cave printing groups, that sort of thing. During his visits, Roderick had frequent contact with Mao and other communist leaders. John Roderick, Associated Press. I saw Mao practically every day in the small downtown area, or at dinners or dances. The leading communists were dressed in their padded woolen clothes because it was wintertime, and they danced around rather awkwardly. Mao was there, and he danced. It was Western music. It was very light-hearted. You saw them in a very unguarded moment. They were much more human. Mao had a price on his head by the Chinese nationalists for $200,000, yet he walked around, often alone or with one single bodyguard. I'd stroll along with him. We'd go to the Chinese opera and sit around in a large building, freezing cold in the wintertime. Small braziers would warm your feet. There, for an hour or two, you lost the impression that you were in a remote part of China. On the stage were actors and actresses in the Peking opera, dressed in their colorful silks and in high falsetto voice, telling the stories of courtesans and emperors. Mao loved it. He received me for dinner one night. We shook hands, and he asked how I was. He had a very good sense of humor. We had a sumptuous meal, and Mao explained that the fish had come from a stream 50 miles away. I couldn't resist saying, "Chairman Mao, this astonishes me. I expected you to be living in poverty, not to eating banquets like this." He says, "Oh, Mr. Roderick, you must remember you're a guest, and nothing's too good for a guest." Then he said, "We may be communists, but we're also Chinese, and we like good food." As I talked to him during the evening, I had a feeling that this was a man very different from any I'd ever met before. Mao was aloof, lost in thought much of the time. Dressed in patched clothes, he was somebody who, if you were in a cocktail party with 100 people, everyone dressed alike, you would gravitate to him. There was an inner strength, a stubbornness, a kind of a superior intelligence. He asked me, did I think that, after the peace was consummated, would somebody like Montgomery Ward, Sears, at the time the 2 leading American retailers, be willing to come to China to start a mail-order business? China was so big and the communication so bad that it'd be a wonderful thing. I was astonished. Seymour Topping, International News Service. That was one of Mao's most important and revealing interviews. Mao was eager to come to an understanding with the United States, but by that time there was so much anti-communist feeling in the United States that Roderick's interview did not get the attention that it deserved. John Roderick, Associated Press. I left in 1947 for Peking. When I did, Mao was at the airport. He said to me, "Lo Deli," that was my Chinese name, "I invite you to visit me in Peking 2 years from now." And, in fact, in less than 2 years, he was in Peking. The cities. Most American reporters, however, were not...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?